September Brown Bag sessions. Marc C. Johnson is our speaker today. Marc has worked as a broadcast journalist, a top aide to Idaho's longest-serving governor, Cecil Andrus, and as a crisis management and communication consultant. American political history has long been his passion. You may be familiar with other books that he's written: Political Hellraiser, The Life and Times of Senator Burton K. Wheeler of Montana, as well as Tuesday Night Massacre, 4 Senate elections on the radicalization of the Republican Party. He's here today to speak on his newest publication, Mansfield and Dirksen, Bipartisan Giants of the Senate. So welcome, Marc.
Thank you, Lindsay. Good afternoon, everybody.
Hello.
Really a beautiful day in Butte. Nice to be back here. I really appreciate the archives. I had a chance to do research here when I was working on my book on Senator Wheeler some years ago, and look forward to figuring out another topic that will bring me back to do some research here at some point.
Good deal.
I can see by the demographic in the room that most of you probably remember the decade of the 1960s. Well, this is really a story about the politics of the 1960s, the political turmoil in the country during that decade. If you remember, it was not a tranquil time. It was not all the Beatles and flower children and sending a man to the moon and returning him safely to Earth. There was a lot going on. Civil rights demonstrations, church bombings, the march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama for voting rights in 1965. International crisis like the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Bay of Pigs, real tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States on a variety of issues. I wanted to tell that story from the perspective of perhaps Montana's most distinguished political figure, Mike Mansfield. And as I researched the story, realizing that Mansfield already had been the subject of a really good biography by Don Obendorfer, a longtime Washington Post reporter, who interviewed Senator Mansfield at length. There's probably no way I could top what Obendorfer had done. I didn't have much more to add to the basic Mansfield story. So I went looking for another angle to write about the great Montanan, and I sort of by happenstance discovered this really unusual and I think wonderful relationship that he had with the Republican leader of the Senate in the 1960s, Everett Dirksen from Illinois. The first line of the book maybe says what the book really is all about. This is a story of the United States Senate that no longer exists. Yet somehow in this decade of turmoil and unrest and civil disobedience on the part of Americans trying to bring about the right to vote, primarily for African Americans, these two giants of the Senate cooperated across the political divide in a way that I suspect most of us would long to see in our politics today. I'll get into some of the details in a moment of some of the things that they accomplished together, but literally nothing happened during the decade of the 1960s legislatively in the Senate. And that's the major civil rights legislation, the creation of Medicare, nuclear test ban treaty in 1962 when John Kennedy was president. None of that happened without broad bipartisan support in the Senate. So it's very much unlike the politics that we experience today. So when you think about the Senate, what do you think about today? What word comes to mind? Turmoil. I think of dysfunction, hyper-partisanship. And it would be easy to think that the Senate has always been that way. And there's an argument to be made that only 3 times in our history has the United States Senate really been meaningfully important to our politics. One time prior to and during the Civil War in the 1850s and 60s. Second time during Franklin Roosevelt's presidency in the 1930s. And the third period would be this period in the 1960s when Mansfield and Dirksen led their respective parties in the Senate. The Senate, you have to understand, and I suspect all of you do, is among the most undemocratic democratic institutions in any democracy in the world, with the possible exception of the British House of Lords. You know, every state has 2 United States senators, regardless of the population. So Wyoming, with what, 585,000 residents, has 2 senators who are just as important as the 2 senators who represent the 39 million people in California. James Madison, when he was writing the Federalist Papers 62, said that there was no arrangement that like this, and there was no basis for this arrangement in democratic theory. But it was merely an expedient way to get small states to agree to come into the Union and accept the Constitution. So there are quirky rules in the Senate, the unlimited debate provisions to protect the rights of the minority, the filibuster, which requires a supermajority to end debate and move on to a vote. Yet the Constitution imbues in the Senate great political power, the power to confirm cabinet members, Supreme Court justices, federal judges, to ratify treaties. And particularly during Mansfield's time in the Senate, the Senate played an outsized role in the development of American foreign policy. So one of the premises of my book is that both Dirksen and Mansfield really believed in this institution as being at the kind of foundation of democratic politics in the United States, and I say Democrat with small d. It was a fundamental building block of democracy in our system. Mansfield often referred to the Senate as the rock of the Republic. So somehow these guys knew that they had to use these quirky rules and get around them as best they could. And to do that, they needed to find a way to come to the middle, to figure out an approach to big issues that allowed both political parties to embrace a solution. I should probably say a quick word about Mike Mansfield's connections here to Butte. I suspect most of you know the basic story. He came to Butte after his military service in the post-World War I period. Incidentally, as far as I know, the only member of Congress ever to serve in 3 different branches of the U.S. military. He lied his way into the United States Navy at age 16 by falsifying his birth certificate to allow him to enlist. He served on a cruiser in the Navy during World War I. Then he later enlisted in the Army and finally served in the Marine Corps, including a stint in the Far East, a few days at least in China, which may have stimulated his interest in Asian history and politics. You see in that picture on the right-hand side of the screen, Mansfield wearing his Marine Corps lapel pin, something that he wore virtually every day of his political life. But he came to Butte in that period and did what a lot of guys with very few prospects did. Took the absolute entry-level job in a mine as a mucker, an experience that I think informed much of the rest of his life. During that period, he fortuitously met Maureen Hayes, who became his wife. She was a school teacher, and she encouraged him to go complete his education. He had been a high school dropout. So he enrolled at the University of Montana. She worked to put him through school. He basically earned his high school equivalency diploma while he was getting his bachelor's degree at Missoula, and then later got a master's degree in history, specializing in Asian history, and then taught at the University of Montana which is what he was doing when he was elected to Congress in 1942. So a remarkable story of somebody who, had a really difficult upbringing. He was shipped off to Great Falls as a very young boy, as his mother had died quite young. His father had been seriously injured in an industrial accident, and he was hard pressed to take care of the kids. So Mike was packed off to Great Falls to live with a relative, and by his own admission, he was a troubled kid. Dropped out of school, got in some trouble, ran away several times, and he rises to the level of being the longest-serving Senate Majority Leader still in the Senate's history, and then served 12 years on top of that as U.S. Ambassador to Japan, a record in both cases. So, lots of connections to Butte. I had the wonderful experience on Monday being in Missoula and seeing my old friend Pat Williams, a former congressman from this part of Montana, a Butte native. And Pat reminds me of this great story of Mansfield, while he was ambassador to Japan, was back in Washington, D.C. for a meeting at the State Department for some reason. And without any knowledge on Mansfield's part, a reception was organized for him up on Capitol Hill. He would not have probably gone to the reception had he known it would have been in his honor. So they had to kind of trick him into showing up at this reception. Receiving line of all notables, members of Congress, come trooping through to shake hands with the ambassador and sort of express their good wishes. And Pat Williams is in the line. He finally gets up to talk to Mike. Mansfield reaches for his hand, pulls him in close, and he says, "Pat, what are we going to do about the Berkeley pit?" This is what was on his mind, as the ambassador to Japan. So a remarkable personal story. Everett Dirksen's story is no less remarkable in many ways. He grew up in kind of a tough circumstances as a farm kid in central Illinois. He had aspirations to be an actor as a young man. Acted in a number of plays as an amateur. Really wanted to be a professional actor. His mother finally had to lay down the law and say, "No, you're not going to be an actor. You have to pick another profession." So, of course, he picked politics, show business by other means. And he was a great showman. You see that pose there. He's sitting cross-legged on his desk talking to reporters at one of his weekly news conferences, which is what he usually did. Climb up on the desk, cigarette in hand, and discourse with reporters. He had a shock of white hair that was usually pretty unruly, suits that were often a size or two too big for him, so he kind of looked like a little bit of unkept. And he had a great voice, an absolutely mesmerizing voice. One reporter dubbed him the Wizard of Ooze. Another referred to his honey tonsils. And he could make a great speech, never using 10 words when 100 would suffice. And in contrast to Mansfield, whose modesty was legendary, whose lack of ego was absolutely remarkable for any politician. Dirksen had an ego. He loved the publicity. He loved to be at the center of all events. So totally different personalities, but a somewhat similar start in their political lives. And they converge in 1961 after President Kennedy is elected. Lyndon Johnson becomes his vice president, and the Senate needs a new majority leader to replace Johnson. And the absolute consensus choice was Mansfield. There was no one else even considered. Dirksen had been the Republican leader since 1959. So the story begins really with Mansfield becoming majority leader in 1961 and beginning to develop this even closer relationship with Dirksen throughout the 60s until Dirksen's death in 1969. I mentioned Dirksen's voice. He actually won a Grammy Award in 1968 for a spoken word record that he recorded. Kind of patriotic prose poems. And it was a best-selling record in the country, if you can believe that, a politician. He appeared on the old What's My Line game show. So that's the kind of publicity hound he was. Now, Mansfield's brilliance is demonstrable in many ways, but he did realize that he could make use of that guy's publicity, his lust for publicity, and utilize it to advance legislation in the Senate. Dirksen had to be seen by his Republican colleagues as being a serious player in Washington, D.C., even though the Democrats controlled the Senate by basically a 2-to-1 margin in this period, most of this period. Dirksen wanted to be a player, obviously, and he wanted to influence things on the Republican side of the aisle. So Mansfield knew on most big issues it was going to require Republican votes to get anything done. And he assiduously courted his relationship with Dirksen in this period. Just to give you a contrast with Mansfield's style, he once appeared on the ABC Sunday morning program Issues and Answers. And in the space of that 30-minute program, he answered 62 different questions. Many of them with a yup or a nope. And several times he just said, I haven't the faintest idea. He was so accessible and so candid with reporters that they obviously loved him. But unlike virtually any politician you can think of, he was genuinely publicity shy. I have a story in the book. I'll just read you a quick paragraph. Neil McNeil was a congressional reporter for Time magazine, knew both of these guys really well, actually wrote a biography of Dirksen, interviewed Mansfield many times. He remembered on one occasion telling Mansfield that his editors had decided to feature the majority leader on the cover of Time magazine, a singular level of political visibility that is still coveted by politicians today. And McNeil says, I got Mansfield off the Senate floor and I said, Senator, I have some really bad news for you. Mansfield said, what's that? I said, the editors of Time magazine have decided to carve your face on Mount Rushmore. They want to put you on the cover. Mansfield was really upset. That's terrible. How can we stop that? He really did not want that kind of publicity. Yet he did appear on it. So you may be able to read that little banner that runs across the upper right of the magazine. It says, can Democrats control a Democratic Senate? It's important to remember that one of the great differences between the Senate today and the Senate in this period is that both parties in the 60s had a great range of ideological views within the party. So you had genuinely conservative Democrats, mostly Southerners, mostly segregationist Southerners, people like Richard Russell from Georgia, James Eastland from Mississippi, Russell Long from Louisiana, very conservative on many things, and certainly very conservative on issues like civil rights and voting rights. Republicans had liberals in the party, people like Jacob Javits from New York and Clifford Case from New Jersey. So it was an imperative for Mansfield as the leader of the Senate to be able to rely upon enough Republican votes to move anything along. And nothing more exemplifies the ability that he had to work across the aisle than the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So Mansfield understood Dirksen, Dirksen respected Mansfield, they learned how to work together, and this remarkable photo kind of summarizes a lot about that period. So here again is Dirksen in the middle of the photo. He's meeting with the leaders of the Civil Rights Movement, Dr. Martin Luther King, Some of his key lieutenants, that's Walter Reuther, the president of the United Auto Workers, who was a big financial backer of the civil rights movement. And the fellow to Dirksen's, right at Dirksen's shoulder there, is a very young John Lewis, who would later be a congressman from the state of Georgia. So Mansfield is meeting with these guys, he's getting his picture taken, it's on the front page of newspapers all over the country, as he is maneuvering his way to get to yes on supporting the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Mansfield met with all these people too, he just never showed up in any pictures doing so. He wanted Dirksen to have the publicity. He later said, during the debate in 1965 over the Voting Rights Act, that it was so important that the country see the Republican leader of the Senate championing voting rights for African Americans. One of his aides said to Mansfield, boss, the troops, meaning the Democratic caucus in the Senate, is getting restless. They see Dirksen getting all of this attention. He's the guy who's appearing on television. He's the guy that's being quoted in the press on our strategy. And all the meetings are taking place in Dirksen's office. Could we not once in a while meet in the majority leader's office? And Mansfield said, no, we're not going to do that. It's so important to the American public to see that the Republican leader of the Senate is out there championing voting rights. So he really understood, both Dirksen's proclivities for publicity and how that could be utilized to bring along Republican votes on an important issue. It was really Mansfield who devised the strategy to get the Civil Rights Act passed in 1964. He knew that the Southern bloc of Democratic senators, led by Russell from Georgia, would filibuster the legislation for as long as they could manage to do so. And that ultimately, the Senate was going to have a real debate on these issues, line by line, literally word by word, work their way through a fairly large piece of legislation. And he organized the Democratic side of the aisle, with Hubert Humphrey from Minnesota being in the kind of the wheelhouse position, to make sure that they really could debate every single aspect of the legislation, figuring that over time, the wisdom of the legislation would be obvious to people and that the votes would follow the debate. An example of Mansfield's fairness, his modesty, occurred early in 1964, just as the Senate was about to begin consideration of the Civil Rights Act. Mansfield knew that Richard Russell was going to be the primary opponent. He would lead the filibuster. So what does Mansfield do? He invites him to his office, and he lays out his entire strategy to Russell. He says, here's what I'm going to do. When the bill comes over from the House, I'm going to stop it at the desk. I'm going to hold it there, not refer it to the Judiciary Committee in the Senate, where James Eastland, another segregationist, had been chairman for a long time and was sure to kill the legislation, just as he had done many times before. We're going to hold it there until we have an opportunity to bring it to the calendar and debate it for as long as it takes to get to a cloture vote, to cut off debate. He says there'll be no tricks. We're not going to stay in session 24 hours a day. Bring in the cots and, have, as he said, have senators padding around in their house slippers, answering a quorum call. We're not going to do any tricks. There'll be no sleight of hand. We're just going to debate, and we're going to reason together on this legislation. Mansfield said later he thought that initially Russell didn't believe it, that surely he had some trick in mind to bring this bill to action more quickly. But over time, Russell realized, the guy is as good as his word. He did not attempt to pull any fast ones, and at the end of that debate, and after the Senate approved the Civil Rights Bill with more than 70 votes in the Senate, including 27 of the 33 Republicans in the Senate at that time, and a strong majority of Democrats, Mansfield wrote a letter to every member of the Senate the other 99 senators, thanking them for the way that they had handled this debate. And one of the more poignant letters that came back was from Dick Russell, his chief opponent, who basically said, "You're an honorable guy. You handled this exactly the way I would have expected you to handle this. And while I don't like the outcome, I have to salute you for how well you handled this legislation." Remarkable. I mean, it's like, the analogy I've been using is it's like the quarterback of a football team handing his playbook over to the middle linebacker across the line and say, here's what we're going to do during this game. That's how transparent Mansfield was in his approach. We know that conversation with Dick Russell took place because Russell talked about it. It's covered by his biographer in detail. And Mansfield, because of the history professor in him, I suspect, it provided a great gift to future historians by keeping detailed notes of these meetings. He wrote contemporaneous memos to his file, memorializing what had happened in those meetings. So you can go, as I have, and my chief research assistant here, Dr. Trish Johnson, have done to the archives at the University of Montana, and you can see those after-action memos, if you will, where Mansfield has an important meeting on some issue and memorializes what actually happened there. Talk about a guy comfortable in his own skin. How many politicians today would memorialize a meeting like that, put it in a file, knowing that somebody 50 or 60 years later could look at it and analyze it? Here's a typical Dirksen scene. Dirksen, deservedly so, deserves great credit for the passage of the Civil Rights and later the Voting Rights Act in 1965. It would not have happened had he not been able to convince a significant number of his fellow Republicans to support that legislation. Interestingly, he tried very hard to convince Barry Goldwater in 1964 to support the Civil Rights Act, knowing that Goldwater would very likely be the Republican presidential nominee that fall. And Goldwater was one of the few Republicans who voted no on the Civil Rights Act. Dirksen famously said in his final speech on the Civil Rights Act, he said he was quoting Victor Hugo, "Stronger than all the armies is an idea whose time has come." Scholar later went back, tried to find that quote from Victor Hugo. It doesn't really exist. There's similar thought, certainly, but the conclusion is that Dirksen, the wordsmith, improved upon Victor Hugo's quotation. That filibuster, that 83-day filibuster, lasted 534 hours, 1 minute and 51 seconds of debate. The final vote was 73-27. And as I said, Dirksen deserves a huge amount of credit, and historians, properly so I believe, have given him a huge amount of credit for the passage of that legislation. Lyndon Johnson deserves a lot of credit because he advanced the legislation after Kennedy's death, made it a priority, kept it in front of the public in a very high-profile way. But I argue in the book that Mansfield's role has largely been ignored, in part because he was so calculating in how he portrayed his own involvement that he has received less credit than he deserves for the passage of that landmark legislation. Because he really did devise the strategy. He put the pieces in place. He built the trust across the political aisle that allowed it to happen. This is one of my favorite pictures of these two guys. Again, Dirksen in the middle of the picture. And of course, he's admiring a portrait of himself. There's a little statue in the portrait of Abraham Lincoln, a young Abraham Lincoln. Dirksen was from central Illinois. His hometown was Pekin, near Peoria. And he always loved to be called the senator from the land of Lincoln. And he could quote at length Abraham Lincoln's speeches. So here's Dirksen admiring a portrait of himself. Mansfield typically, if he's even in the photo, he's at the very edge of the photo, peering over his shoulder, wearing his Marine Corps lapel pin, you should see. Here's another favorite photo. This is the Democratic leadership meeting outside of the White House in 1962. So you got Lyndon Johnson in the middle of the picture, then Vice President. He's speaking to House Speaker McCormick from Massachusetts, a future Speaker Carl Albert on the far left, Hale Boggs right behind him, who was the Assistant Majority Leader in the House. On the other side of the frame, Hubert Humphrey, who was Mansfield's assistant, the whip, and behind him, George Smathers of Florida, who was the conference chairman. And Mansfield's got his back to the camera. He's leaving. He's leaving the press conference. John Kennedy liked this photo so much, he had a copy made and inscribed it to Mansfield. He said, "To Mike, who knows when to go and when to stay." I should say just a word about Mansfield's relationship with John Kennedy, which was a little bit of a revelation for me to realize how close these guys became. Almost a brother-to-brother relationship, or since Mansfield was somewhat older than John Kennedy, maybe almost a father or an uncle to a nephew kind of relationship. They were extremely close. They both were elected to the Senate in 1952. They sat next to each other, side by side, in desks in the Senate chamber in their early careers. Both served on the Foreign Relations Committee together. Both were Irish Catholics. Now, Kennedy admittedly came from a little more robust family economic situation than Mansfield did. But they became very, very close. So much so that in 1961, right after the election, there was some discussion about, well, gee, who does the White House really want to be the Senate Majority Leader to replace Johnson? And Johnson, if you've read any of Robert Caro's books about him, you know he was a domineering, arm-twisting, deal-making, overbearing SOB a lot of the time. Very difficult guy to deal with, unless you did what he wanted you to do. And Mansfield's attitude was entirely different approach. So one of Kennedy's aides says to him, "Do you really think Mike Mansfield is up to the job?" And Kennedy says, "Absolutely. I want Mike Mansfield in that role. I want somebody up on Capitol Hill that I can absolutely trust to be honest with me and to look out for the administration's best interest." So they had a very, very close relationship. So close that when the president was assassinated in November of 1963, Jackie Kennedy asked Mansfield to be the eulogist at the memorial service that was held for the president in the rotunda of the Capitol building on those terrible days right after Kennedy's murder. And she wanted only Mansfield to speak at that memorial service. Protocol, she was told, dictated that you really needed somebody from the House of Representatives to make remarks, and ideally from the Supreme Court. So ultimately, Speaker McCormick spoke, Chief Justice Earl Warren spoke at that memorial service, but it's Mansfield's eulogy that is the only one that anybody remembers. He had read over that weekend, between Kennedy's murder on Friday and the memorial service a couple of days later, a story about how she had removed the wedding ring from her finger and placed it in the president's hand in his casket. And he used that as a symbol to weave into his eulogy. Reportedly stayed up all night working with his aide, Francis Vallejo, to craft what was a very short eulogy. Very, in my view, a very poignant, very moving little talk. But it was criticized at the time by some who didn't quite understand what Mansfield was trying to do with the eulogy. Let me read you just a couple of sentences from it, and I think you'll maybe agree with me that it endures pretty well. He says, "There was a man marked with scars of his love of country," a reference obviously to Kennedy's military service, "a body active with a surge of life, far from spent, and in a moment it was no more. And so she took a ring from her finger and placed it in his hands. There was a father with a little boy and a little girl, and a joy of each in the other, and in a moment it was no more. And so she took a ring from her finger and placed it in his hand." In leaving us with these gifts, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, President of the United States, leaves with us. Will we take these gifts, Mr. President? Will we have now the sense and the responsibility and the courage to take the gifts? I pray to God that we shall, and under God we will. I will never forget Mike Mansfield's speech Lady Bird Johnson wrote in her diary. He, the most precise and restrained of men, repeated over and over the phrase, "And she took a ring from her finger and placed it in his hand." William Manchester wrote his book, The Death of a President, about the Kennedy assassination and all that happened around it. And he talked to Mrs. Kennedy about the eulogy and whether she approved of the way it had come down in the rotunda of the Capitol. And she absolutely loved what Mansfield had said, and said that only Mansfield had captured for her what had really happened in that awful day. When we were doing our research in the archives in Missoula, Trish found the handwritten note from Jackie Kennedy to Senator Mansfield, where she thanked him for the eulogy. When Mansfield finished his little talk, he took the copy that he was reading from of the eulogy, walked over, and handed it to Mrs. Kennedy. And she said, "How did you know I wanted that?" So Trish found the handwritten note, which is pretty poignant. And then 10 years later, one of the networks did a special to kind of commemorate or remember the 10th anniversary of Kennedy's murder. And Jackie Kennedy had watched that, and she wrote another really poignant note to Mansfield, thanking him, saying how important he had been to their family and how much Jack had loved him. Dirksen had a close relationship with Kennedy too, different kind of relationship. He suggested to Kennedy during the 1960 campaign, imagine Mitch McConnell suggesting this to Joe Biden. Kennedy was losing his voice because he's out speaking every day, and he was starting to lose his voice. And Dirksen says, "Jack, you need to speak more from your diaphragm. You're speaking from your throat. Bring it up from your diaphragm." Kennedy actually took Dirksen's advice, hired a speech coach, improved his performance as a speaker, and saved his voice. So that says a little something about their relationship. Dirksen had an even closer relationship with Lyndon Johnson. They obviously had served in the Senate together. One reporter said it was a friendship among crooks, meaning guys who were, transactional politicians who were willing to make a deal. The story's been said that, been told many times that Dirksen would come down to the White House at the end of the legislative day, have a couple of bourbons with President Johnson, and Johnson would say, "Ev, important piece of legislation coming up, I need 3 or 4 Republican votes." And Dirksen would say, "Well, I'll see what I can do, Mr. President." He'd reach in his pocket, pull out a piece of paper and say, I've got a couple appointments that I need to the Interstate and Federal Communications Commission. So they were very transactional politicians. Lady Bird Johnson, again in her diary, remembered walking in on them while they were talking about the Voting Rights Act in 1965, literally nose to nose, engaged in their political back and forth. She came back 2 hours later and they were still in the same boat. So remarkable relationships between these two guys and the presidents that they served. As Mansfield said, I never served under a president, I served with a president. So again, a little bit different than our politics today, needless to say. So the proof is in the pudding. If you're a legislator, what did you do? What did you accomplish? This is a partial list. Everything from those civil rights and voting rights acts, fair housing acts that dealt with racial segregation and voting rights, passage of the Wilderness Act in 1964, the creation of public broadcasting, creation of the National Endowments for the Arts and Humanities, food stamps, Clean Air Act, Medicare. I don't suspect that's important to anybody in this room. All of that happened in that period from 1962, really through 1968. And it was interesting for me to research the legislative history of some of this legislation. Not that it wasn't all or most of it controversial, it certainly was, but many of these pieces of legislation passed on a voice vote. There wasn't even a recorded vote in the Senate on some of these important pieces of legislation. And that's a reflection, I think, of one of Mansfield's tenets that he talked about all the time: practice self-restraint. In other words, you might be opposed to a particular piece of legislation, but you might know as well that there was a majority in support of it. So why filibuster it just for the sake of filibustering it when you know the outcome is going to be contrary to your point of view? Facilitate the debate and get on with it. Use some self-restraint. So it's a remarkable level of accomplishment, perhaps only rivaled in modern American history, or any American history, with Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal in 1933, and then what sometimes is referred to as the Second New Deal in 1935, passage of Social Security and the Public Utilities Holding Company Act, and all the legislation, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, et cetera, the Banking Act that was passed in 1933. So it's been said, and I think I agree, that we really live in Lyndon Johnson's world, with so many of these pieces of legislation still being important to the daily lives of Americans today. But if we live in Lyndon Johnson's world, we also have to say we live in the world of Mike Mansfield and Everett Dirksen. I want to finally just leave you with one more bit of wisdom from Senator Mansfield. As I said earlier, his approach to Senate leadership was not without some controversy, at least early in his career. Some Democrats thought he was not up to the job, he was not strong enough, he wasn't willing to crack the whip, that he was too willing to accommodate the other side of the aisle, too deferential to Dirksen. One historian has said, and I agree, Mansfield actually confounded his opponents, confounded his critics, because he accumulated political power by giving it away. He had more respect, a greater sense of trust, if you will, across the political aisle, because he was willing to defer to Dirksen on many things. But in 1963, the criticism was coming pretty rapidly at Mansfield. And for a while, he ignored the criticism, and then finally decided that he needed to address it and to make a statement about his approach to political leadership. So he worked for some days to prepare a speech that he was scheduled to deliver on Friday afternoon, November 22nd, 1963, the day that President Kennedy was assassinated. So needless to say, the Senate adjourned on the news of Kennedy's assassination. He did not have a chance to deliver that speech. It was entered into the congressional record, and it wasn't until many years later, long after his retirement from public life, that Mansfield was invited back to the Senate by the then Senate Majority Leader Trent Lott of Mississippi and the Democratic leader Tom Daschle of South Dakota to give the speech that he had wanted to give in 1963. So here's just a couple of lines from that speech. I do my best to be courteous, decent, and understanding of others, and sometimes I fail at it. But it is for the Senate to decide whether these characteristics are incompatible with leadership. I have tried to treat others as I would like to be treated, and almost invariably have been. And it is for the Senate to decide, too, whether that characteristic is incompatible with Senate leadership. And finally, within this body, I believe every member ought to be equal in fact as well as in theory, that they have a primary responsibility to the people that they represent to face the legislative issues of the nation. And to the extent the Senate may be inadequate in this connection, the remedy lies not in seeking of shortcuts, not in cracking of non-existent whips, nor in wheeling and dealing, but in an honest facing of the situation and a resolution by the Senate itself, by accommodation, by respect for one another, by mutual restraint, and as necessary, by adjustments in the procedures of this body. So this is a guy who's basically saying, practice the golden rule. Treat other people the way you expect to be treated yourself. Be candid, be modest. Don't expect that you have to always be in the right. The other side might have something to add to the debate. You ought to listen. A remarkable approach to political leadership that in our hyper-partisan time seems almost unfathomable to me. So over the course of the last, 50 years or so, Mansfield has consistently been remembered by every majority leader on both sides of the political aisle. And the Senate, almost every 2 years or 4 years now changes control from Republican to Democrat and back. But every majority leader has invoked his name at one time or another as the model of a Senate leader. There's a Mansfield room in the Capitol, one of the most elegant rooms in the Capitol, with a portrait of Mike, pipe in hand, looking down on the room. Yet, it's interesting to me that all of these majority leaders who say that they respect the way Mansfield ran the Senate really don't try to emulate his style. We have slipped into this hyper-partisanship where the idea of working across the aisle is not seen as a matter of statesmanship, but as a surrender to the enemy. And that goes some distance, I think, to explain the political problems we have in the country today. So, a couple of remarkable characters. Lots more in the book if you're interested, and I'd be delighted to try to respond to a few questions if you have some. Yes, sir.
Well, thank you for the presentation. It's excellent. I grew up in Peoria, Illinois, and know quite a bit about Pekin. Just drive across the Illinois River. It's basically like driving from here to Anaconda, so it's pretty easy to get there. Played a lot of athletic sporting events over in Pekin. But I bring that up because my family were not Dirksen people. We had two pictures in our house of politicians. One was Adlai Stevenson and the other was JFK. But he was baffling to my parents, as you mentioned, because of the bipartisanship of civil rights. And I just bring this up as a point because the area that he represented in central Illinois is extremely conservative. I mean, it has a Ku Klux Klan history. And for him to kind of rise above some of the constituency, you wouldn't really see that so much today. I think he was really voting his conscience, and I want to applaud you for bringing that point up. But he was very baffling for my parents because my mom always hoped that Stevenson would run against him and defeat him. But anyway, I just want to thank you for, I've come, since I've been in Montana, I left when I was like 18 to come out here, but to know about Mike Mansfield has been great, but to pair him up with Dirksen, I think is incredible that you did that, so thank you.
Appreciate it, thank you very much. Yeah, you're absolutely right. You know that part of central Illinois better than I do, but I'm doing some research about Dirksen's early days, and he was elected to the House of Representatives in 1932 during the Roosevelt landslide. So he was one of the very few Republicans in the country who won a seat as a freshman coming into Congress. And in one particular newspaper that I consulted, there was a story about a speech that Dirksen had given someplace in his congressional district in central Illinois. And right next to it was a story about a Ku Klux Klan rally. So yeah, he came from a very, very conservative area. Like all politicians, he was motivated to some degree by a desire to be reelected, an overwhelming desire these days by most politicians to be reelected. And in 1962, he got a really stiff challenge. That was a year that Stevenson was encouraged to run against him and opted not to. A congressman from Chicago, Sid Yates, who went on to a very distinguished career in Congress, eventually became chairman of the Interior Appropriations Committee and wielded a lot of influence in the West. Really a great guy. He did run against Dirksen and was baffled by the fact that he couldn't get President Kennedy until literally the 11th hour in the election to publicly endorse his candidacy. And Kennedy's calculation was pretty interesting and pretty politically astute. He told one of his aides, do we really need one more Democratic senator, or should we have somebody who is a little bit friendly to us on the Republican side? So he made that calculation not to, go all in to support Sid Yates, and Dirksen eventually won the election. Kennedy also helped Dirksen in that period when the Cuban Missile Crisis occurs in October of 1962, right in the middle of Dirksen's campaign. And the White House calls and says Dirksen needs to return to Washington to consult with the president about a response to these Soviet missiles in Cuba. Dirksen says to his wife, Luella, you're in charge of the campaign. The president has summoned me to the Capitol. So big headlines, of course. Dirksen, summoned to the White House to consider the crisis in Cuba, which didn't hurt his campaign, needless to say. In that campaign, by the way, Mansfield did not do anything to help Sid Yates, the Democratic candidate. In fact, a few days before the election, he announced that he was going to be leaving on a major foreign trip, and Dirksen was going with it. They were going to visit, capitals around the world. So Mansfield is signaling that he thinks Dirksen's going to win, and he wants to take him on this fact-finding trip around the world. As it turned out, Dirksen didn't make the trip, but it didn't hurt that the clear message was that Mansfield wanted to see him reelected as well. And then 2 years later, Mansfield's up for reelection, 1964, and a reporter says to Dirksen, are you going to be campaigning around the country for Republican Senate candidates? And he said, oh yes, I'll try to do the most I can to help. Don't ask me to go to Montana. Yes, sir.
I think it's interesting about the election in 1942 when Mansfield first was elected, because he was elected to the seat that Jeanette Rankin had.
Exactly.
And if she had not voted against the war, her political career would not have been destroyed. And 42 was actually a pretty good Republican year.
It was, yep.
And would he have even been elected? Would,
Yeah, it's a great what if or a counterfactual. And then 4 years later, 1946, Mansfield seriously considers running against Burton K. Wheeler in the Democratic primary. Wheeler is really banged up at this point because of his pre-war isolationism and his criticism of Roosevelt's foreign policy, even during World War II. And Mansfield's receiving widespread encouragement across Montana to run against Wheeler in the Democratic primary that year. And I know from researching the Wheeler biography that typical Mansfield, he kept notes of all these conversations he had with Democratic leaders across Montana as he called them up on the phone and asked them a series of questions. Should I run? If I run, can I count on your support? Do you think there'll be financial resources available to support the campaign? He had a list of a half a dozen questions, and he kept notes about the answers from county chairmen and prominent Democrats across Montana. At the end of the calculation, he decided not to run against Wheeler. And of course, Wheeler loses the Democratic nomination to Leif Erikson, and then Erikson loses to Zales Acton, the first Republican elected to the Senate in Montana in, 35 years or something like that. And I asked Mansfield, one time I had an opportunity to visit with him, I asked him about why he didn't run against Wheeler in 1946. And typical Mike, he said, didn't think I could win. And I made a note of that and quoted him in the book on that. And then as I researched this book, I thought, I wonder if he was really talking about the Democratic primary or the general election that year. I think he would have beaten Wheeler in a primary, but he may have had trouble winning the Senate race in 1946 because it was a good Republican year. Republicans gained control of the Senate for the first time in 15 or 16 years in 1946. So he may well have lost that Senate race. So he wisely calculated to stay in the House, wait until 1952 when the environment was better for him and for Democrats, and get elected to the Senate there. A really tough campaign he had in 1952 that was dominated by Joe McCarthy. McCarthy came to Montana to campaign for Acton, came awfully close to accusing Mansfield of being a communist sympathizer, which is just outrageous, but nonetheless it was the politics of that day. But he did win that election and never really had a serious contest after that. So much so that he really never really, he campaigned for sure, but he didn't put up billboards or take out newspaper ads or spend a lot of money on radio or television. It was person-to-person campaigning. One of his aides said she couldn't believe how much coffee he must have drank during those campaigns because he just moved from one town to the other, from one coffee shop to the next, sitting there talking to people. That's how he campaigned. Yes, sir.
What was his relationship with Arnold Olson?
I don't think particularly close, but I think Mansfield had kind of almost a hands-off policy to state level politics. I think he really saw himself as looking out for Montana's interests in Washington, D.C., and somebody else was kind of responsible at the state level. I don't think he had an antagonistic relationship with anybody, really, but not a particularly close relationship, I don't believe. A lot of people claimed a close relationship with him because it reflected better on them than it may have on Mansfield. Yes?
I thought it was interesting when we went to his gravesite, and it said Mike Mansfield, U.S. Marine Corps.
Right.
Nothing about all of this.
No, he was enormously proud of his Marine Corps service, and spoke often of how important it was to have been with the Marine Corps. And yeah, you're right. The headstone just simply says Mike Mansfield, PFC, U.S. Marine Corps.
What about Maureen? You never mentioned Maureen, I think.
Well, I should have mentioned Maureen.
I think she was extremely influenced.
Well, to hear the senator say he would have been a nothing burger without her, that she, I think I did mention that she encouraged him to go get his complete his education. He never made a public appearance, I don't think, where he didn't reference her and how important she was to his life and his career. I don't know that I would describe her exactly as a political wife in the sense that she was an advisor to him as much as she was a supporter and somebody who obviously he took great comfort in their relationship. And I think his own personal health and well-being declined pretty remarkably after she passed. But yeah, you can, in this period, I think you could probably count on one hand the number of political Washington relationships that were really special, and they certainly had one. I mean, he insisted, for example, when the statue was placed in the state capitol in Helena, that don't put a statue of me in there if she's not in it, and she is. So it's the Marine and Mike Mansfield Library at the University of Montana. So he very much considered her, his full partner, and I think she really was. There is a couple of funny stories about how basically shy he was and taciturn in his ability to carry on a conversation, or his willingness to carry on a conversation. One story about famous Washington, D.C. hostess having a dinner party and inviting the Mansfields to dinner, and not sitting the wife next to the husband, but separating them across the room, and debating for several days, who do I sit next to Senator Mansfield, because it's going to be a difficult conversation at dinner. He's going to answer every question with one or two words. It's hard to engage him in conversations. I mean, he certainly wasn't antisocial, but he was just a very shy, retiring guy in so many ways. Well, you're a great audience. Thank you so much. I'll just say finally, one of the motivating factors for me in wanting to write this book was I think we need political heroes. And Mike Mansfield, I think, deserves to be in that category. A truly remarkable American.